Hi guys, it's Hila here from Saturday Night Stitch. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today's post, we're going to be looking at how to add your seam allowances to your Burda pattern. And this is part 4. So by now, you know how to read the pattern. You know which size you need to select. But a few things to note before you go straight ahead and start tracing and adding your seam allowances. You want to make a note of all those notches. So you look at your pattern drawing and it tells you which notches are supposed to be there and you look for those. You also want to put in those numbers that tell you which seam to attach when. Those are critical when you are actually sewing your pattern, when you're sewing your garment and you're following the instructions. So make a note of those before you start tracing. Now that you know to do that, let's move on to the next step. The first thing that you have to be able to do is to see the line that you are tracing. So in here, I have laid my baking parchment over my pattern sheet. And I'm sure when you're there, that's the blue line that I have to be tracing. Okay, so you gotta see your line and then you bring your ruler right up against the line if you're going to use a ruler, or you don't have to use a ruler if you don't want to, but that just means that you're not going to get any straight lines. So you want to bring your ruler right up to that line and then you just draw it. And when we do this, it means that you will have the option of adding your seam allowances later. So this is the very basic number one way to do your tracing. You just trace the outline first, and then later on go and add your seam allowances using the ruler. You're also remembering to put in those notches as you come across them. And because you've made a note of them before you started tracing, you have an idea of where to expect them, which makes it a lot easier. That line was a simple centerfold line, but what about when you've got your different size lines? In this particular case, I am tracing out a size 38 and there are at least 5 different size lines. So you have to make a note of which one is your size line. Mine is the short dashed one, so I just always have to keep an eye out for that. Or I do this thing where I count that is 1 line in or it's 3 lines in, and you just follow that using your ruler if you want to, or you don't have to use the ruler. You just follow the curve, again constantly checking. Even I sometimes get preoccupied and I forget, and then I trace the wrong one. So that's something that you sort of have to be mindful of because you can easily forget. Another way is to immediately add your seam allowance as you have drawn it straight away. So there I've drawn the line for my size 38, and then I'm using my ruler to actually add in my 1/2 inch seam allowance, because this is what I prefer to work with. If you prefer to work with a larger or smaller seam allowance, you just add as you see fit. But then the idea is you draw your line, which is your first tracing line, and then you add your seam allowance straight away. Takes a little bit longer, but the more you do it, it does get easier. So this is something else that you can do. Instead of drawing out your entire pattern piece, then adding the seam allowances afterwards, you add them as you go along, using the 2-step of doing the first traced line and then the seam allowance line. Armhole curves can be a bit tricky, and I just tend to freehand those, and that's never been a problem. Remembering again to make a note of those seam numbers. Those are very important when you're actually sewing, and making a note of all of those notches. But again, this will be easier for you because you have checked before you started tracing. And believe me, there's nothing more annoying than realizing that you missed a crucial notch and you have to go back and unfold your sewing pattern magazine. At this point, it's important to get into the good habit of labeling your pattern pieces correctly straight away. So for me, I put the year and month, the style number, and a brief description of it. my size that I have traced, the pattern piece and how many I have to cut, and also if I've added seam allowances or if I haven't. So my shorthand is NSA for no seam allowances, because sometimes I do add the seam allowances whilst I'm cutting the fabric, but in this case I'm doing a 1/2 inch, so I'll just write 1/2 inch seam allowance. This is critical because the more you sew with your sewing pattern magazines, you are going to have a lot of traced pattern pieces, and you need to be able to identify where that pattern piece comes from. And trust me, having been through the process of struggling to identify a certain pattern piece, it can be very frustrating. So this is a very important habit to just get into straight away. Every single pattern piece, as soon as you've traced it out, you want to put your year, number, and style number on it. Now we're going to add a seam allowance to curves, because chances are you'll come across curves in the form of your armholes or your necklines. So I'm just going to show you how I'm adding the seam allowance to a pre-drawn line. So this is that first method where we draw the line first, and then we use the ruler to give us the seam allowance that we want. So I just go right up until my traced line is lined up with my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I draw along the edge. When it comes to the fold line in Burdastyle sewing magazine, you will notice that when you look at the pattern pieces, it shows the fold line by a dashed line. So if you're used to sewing with the big 4, you probably expect the fold line to be shown with a symbol that's very similar to what I am drawing there, but that's not the case. So when you see a dashed line, you know that's the fold line. But on the actual magazine pattern sheet itself, it isn't a dashed line, it is a solid line. I like to line up the edge of my baking parchment paper with the fold line. It's more economical that way because I don't have to try and cut a perfectly straight line. I'm assuming that this has been manufactured with a perfectly straight line, which is perfect for my needs. Now I'm going to show you how I actually do my tracing, and I call it in one go. That's the simplest way I could think of to explain it. So I've shown you how you trace your actual line first, and then you add your seam allowance to it. So what I do actually is I look at my line that I have to trace. So this is my size 38 dashed line, and I don't draw the line straight away. So what I do is I take up my ruler, I butt it up against that line, and then I start adding my seam allowance straight away to that. So I move it all the way up until the dashed size 38 line is underneath the 1/2 inch line. And so therefore, I'm just drawing the one traced line, which is already including the seam allowance. It's quite challenging to try and draw and hold my camera at the same time, so I'm going to try and show it to you again from a different angle. So here we go. We have my size 38 line right there, and then I just slide my ruler along whilst it's adding the seam allowance. And once my size 38 line is matching up with that 1/2 inch line, then I trace it. So I'm effectively adding my seam allowance in one go, hence why I call it one go, in one go. It's a bit silly, but that's the best way to try and explain it. And this is how I add my seam allowance, and I find this to be incredibly fast because I don't have to do the first line first and then trace it on. I have been doing this for a few years now, and honestly, I know it starts off quite challenging, but the more you do it, it does get easier. And ultimately, you want to reach a point where tracing the patterns from your magazine is as fast and as efficient as possible. That's the one in go method, which means that I don't have the two lines that show you that I've added the seam allowance. It's just got the line with the seam allowance included. and that's where this ruler comes in handy. Another method I use is adding the seam allowances straight onto the fabric as I am getting ready to cut out. And for this method, you can use tailor's chalk or any marking pen that will show you where to cut. So there I have my pattern piece. In this case, it's a PDF from the Burda website. And I'm going to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And so that's just what I do, butt up against that 1/2 inch line, and I use my chalk to just place markings along the edge so that I can see where I'm going to cut out. But I've already pinned the pattern pieces matching the grain line, etc. And then you just add them on. This is equally applicable to your magazine sewing patterns as well as to your PDF sewing patterns that you can get from the website. Another way that you can do it is you can actually eyeball it, which is what I sometimes do, especially when I'm sewing with knit fabrics. And that basically means just cutting straight into the fabric and estimating my seam allowance. And the more you do that, the easier it gets, and you can get quite accurate with it. And in fact, in haute couture, they don't actually add the seam allowances by using pens or pencil. They eyeball it. So it is a good practice to get into. And yes, initially when you start off, there will be a lot of mistakes and wastages, but that is the process of learning. But I've shown it to you using the chalk because that is one easier way of doing it. But trust me, when you try to eyeball it, eventually you do get better at eyeballing your seam allowances. And as you delve deeper into the craft of sewing, you begin to use different seam allowances for different aspects. So I particularly like industrial sewing techniques, and you can see my neck seam allowances are only 1/2 inch so that I don't have to do any grading, but that's stuff for another video. So now you are armed with the knowledge to go forth and enjoy your sewing magazines. There's nothing to stop you now. You know the different ways to add your seam allowances. I have shared with you some of the mistakes that I have made so that you don't have to make the mistakes. Number one, make sure you label your pattern pieces. You don't want to mess that up. And make sure you know what seam allowance you have added on there. Just pick a method to use and go for it, guys. It's a wonderful way to sew, and it does get better. If you have any questions, do ask me in the comments box down below. And I do hope that you found this video useful. And if you did, do give it a big thumbs up down below. And until I see you next time, guys, happy sewing. Bye.